This is The Zero Hour with RJ Eskow, produced by the We Act Radio Network in Washington, D.C., and broadcast across the nation. Visit us online at thisisthezerohour.com or at youtube.com/thezerohour. Ladies and gentlemen, RJ Eskow.
And we are back for another edition of The Zero Hour. I'm Richard R.J. Eskow, and I guess we can't let the morning go by without mentioning the story of the week. This week, we had Bergdalsey instead of Benghazi. Bergdalsey is the story where flip-flopping Republicans who were used to be for letting an American soldier go and were complaining just weeks ago that Obama wasn't releasing Bo Bergdahl are now instead, they've flip-flopped and they want to let the Taliban torture an American soldier instead. Because let's face it, I had the same thought that Harry Reid did when he said apparently what they want is not American justice, but Taliban justice. That and only that is the position that the Republicans are arguing. Now, people will say Republicans haven't yet won that argument. Let's talk about this a little differently. The Bergdahl story completely dominated the news this week, drowning out much more important debates that were taking place in the Senate, for example, about student debt, which is crippling an entire generation, which has passed the $1 trillion mark. The Senate is scaling up for a debate and a vote in the upcoming week. They talked about it. There was talk about it in the newspaper. Elizabeth Warren is introducing a bill. Did you hear about that? Or did you hear about Bo Bergdahl? The Senate is also debating a constitutional amendment to get corporate money out of politics. Did you hear about that? Or did you hear about Bo Bergdahl? What have we learned from this? As usual, the Republicans win the media game again. And you know what? The media plays right along with it. And people are going to say, oh, wait, but the soldier's dad, he looked like a Muslim. He sounded like a Muslim. He used Muslim-y words from the White House podium. Well, what's the worst way? What's the worst that could happen? What's the worst truth that you can imagine? That maybe somewhere along the way, Bo Bergdahl's dad maybe became a Muslim? I don't think he did, because folks in his community, according to reports see him at his Christian church Sunday after Sunday after Sunday. But supposing he was a Muslim, so what? There are millions of peaceful and productive Muslim Americans living in this country. They don't do any harm. Just the idea that it would be a scandal if this guy was a Muslim is reinforcing the notion that there's something wrong with being a Muslim. That's the kind of bigotry we have to fight. And besides, with millions of Muslim Americans contributing to our economy, working, living peacefully here, what's one more or less? Well, why is that even a story when the real story should be fighting to get corporate money out of our political system? But the media doesn't know about that, and apparently the media doesn't care about that, which means that the American people won't either, because nobody's talking about it for them. Isn't that a shame? Isn't that kind of tragic? One more thing. In other underreported news, I'll bet you missed this one since most people did. From the LA Times, I want to read you a little something that the LA Times had to say this week. They said, but this is a story from Seattle. Quote, a man wielding a shotgun, armed with a knife and wearing a black hoodie, quickly fired several rounds at a small Christian university in Seattle on Thursday afternoon. Killing a 20-year-old, it's tragic, of course, killing a 20-year-old man and injuring 3 others. But now here's the interesting part of the story. The story goes on to say, quote, a student security guard at Seattle Pacific University at its engineering building fired pepper spray at the suspect as he paused to reload at about 3:20 p.m. The student then this is a student working as guard. The student then pinned down the suspect until police arrived minutes later and took him into custody. Think about that for a second. What does this story tell us? Here's what's interesting. Nobody but the suspect was armed, except with pepper spray, and the situation was resolved. The man was stopped before he could kill again, without the use of guns. If there had been armed civilians all over that university, packing heat, carrying concealed weapons, as the NRA and its fantasy death cult would have wanted, that campus would have been littered with bodies, not necessarily including the killers. We've seen this happen before. Passersby, people who are standing around who see an act of violence happen or hear shooting, pull out their guns and start shooting wildly. Even when police do it. It happened at the Empire State Building. People don't know how to stay calm and use a gun in a smart way in a situation like this. And can you imagine if 2 or 3 guys had a gun, somebody hears a shot, 3 guys pull out guns, they each think the other is the perpetrator and they kill each other and a bunch of bystanders at the same time? That's the world the NRA and the other gun nuts want. Oh, by the way, and in other gun news, here's a story from Bloomberg. Gun control activists are renewing pressure on discount giant Target to ban firearms in its stores. Why? Because apparently what happened, I'm going to just skip ahead here, a loss prevention officer, that's somebody who goes around Target stores looking for risks, found a real loaded gun in the toy aisle of a Myrtle Beach branch of Target last night. Says the local NBC affiliate, quote, "The gun was in plain view on top of a superhero play school toy box when the worker found it. He thought it was a toy. He realized it was real after seeing it was loaded with live ammo." Okay, so that's what we're up against now. The fact that it was in a toy section in an aisle of Target means that any child could have picked that toy up or thinking it was a toy and fired it and killed himself or killed somebody else. Remember, folks, this is something that's been going on. We have people who just think guns are toys, even when they kill people. We have people, who knows how this got here? Some people are saying it was a deliberate act of sabotage, that somebody wanted a child to get killed. We don't really know the backstory behind this because the perpetrator hasn't been arrested yet. They've got the video. But in the meantime, we've still, in this culture, got extremists out there misreading the Second Amendment and insisting that the right to carry a gun trumps the right for children and other Americans to live. Remember, guns don't kill people. Idiots who won't let us pass sensible gun control legislation kill people, and we're going to keep fighting that. I'm Richard R.J. Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour. We'll be right back after this. Back on the Zero Hour. And with us now is Brad Markell. Brad is currently the executive director at the AFL-CIO Industrial Union Council. He spent most of his life in the auto industry, been a production worker for General Motors, taught at Wayne State University in Michigan, and before that managed the labor and manufacturing program at the Manufacturing Extension Program Center in Michigan. Brad, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me on, RJ. Great.
Oh, you bet. Listen, I got a couple of things I want to talk to you about. We had the president of the AFL-CIO, Richard Trumka, on last week. We had a great conversation with him. I want to follow up on a couple of things he and I discussed back then. But before we get to that, the big news of the past week since President Trumka was on is the president's bill on the environment and carbon emissions. And you guys and President Trumka put out a statement, and while I kind of get what he's trying to say, it's come in for a little bit of criticism on the left, and I was wondering if we could just talk a little bit about where you guys are at in terms of this kind of legislation.
Well, sure. First, let's just square everything up for the listeners. The EPA this week proposed new regulations for existing power plants. They made a proposal, and it's going to be finalized next June, and then the states all have to implement their own plan. So this is not something that the EPA is going to do nationwide, but it's throwing it out to the states to hit some limits that the EPA has put forward. And then by June 2016, the states have to come forward with a plan. They can group together if they want to, And EPA's put out, I think, a pretty innovative, flexible approach to dealing with carbon pollution from power plants. And so it's complicated, but it's a necessary first step.
Well, I think a lot of us agree with that, and the statement clearly supported the concept, but it expressed some concerns about the impact on workers, particularly in specific states, and I think that's where the discussion has to take place. And basically, just briefly, what were those concerns that you guys had?
So, the concerns that we have are around the sectors and communities that are linked to the coal economy, all the way from the coal miners to the rail workers that transport the coal. A huge fraction of all rail freight in the United States is actually coal, to the people who work at the power plants. And it's very clear that, EPA is projecting we'll still have a pretty good mix of coal, something like 30% of coal in our power production, but there's going to be a decline in those communities, in those jobs. So we're worried about those folks. We're also extremely concerned about the pensions of people who are already retired or may be close to retirement, and making sure that they don't get shorted on the pension and health care benefits that they've been working for their whole lives. And then finally, I'd say there's another broad category. We know that a lot of jobs are going to be created in renewable energy and in energy efficiency, and we want to make sure that those are jobs that, in the case of clean energy products, are manufactured here, and in both cases that we're actually creating good jobs that come with decent pay and benefits. So that's a big focus for us going forward. At this time, the green job situation is that it's mostly non-union, and the pay is not there. So a big concern about, are we replacing good jobs with jobs that may not be so good, and how do we deal with that?
So, okay, and when I read the statement and talking with you now, I guess people might, I could come in for criticism on one side of this debate or another, either that I'm being too easy on you guys or too rough on you guys or that don't care about the environment or pushing it at the expense of American workers, whatever. But I guess what it comes down to, and I wanted to ask you about this, is that I don't really think I'm wimping out of that fight when I say I really don't see that this has to be either or. And I didn't really read the statement. I heard some folks criticize, but I didn't really read it as saying either or. Here's what I read, and you tell me if I'm wrong. I read it as saying, if you guys had come out and said, we don't like this bill, we don't want to reduce carbon emissions because we got to worry about our guys and their jobs, I would have come down hard on you. But I think what I heard and read was, look, we got to do this. Everybody agrees with that. We know that. But let's make sure that when we do that, we're looking out, A, that we create good jobs, not just jobs in green tech, as you mentioned, and B, let's keep thinking about the regions of the country that have already been hit pretty hard, and I'm thinking of the coal mining regions, of course, among others, and let's make sure that any plan we have for expanding the green economy takes those parts of the country and those workers into consideration. Now, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but that's what I read. Am I getting close?
No, that's actually a very fair summary. There's nobody inside the union movement at the leadership level who is a climate denier and doesn't think we need to act on climate. Even Cecil Roberts, the president of the coal miners, is very clear on that point. In fact, you will not hear him use the term war on coal. Excuse me. He won't use the term war on coal because he realizes that's a Republican formulation put forward for people who are no more for the labor movement than they are for the environment. So it's from our point of view, we try to put out a balanced statement that really laid out all the concerns of working people as we go through this. And it was not at all to be saying that we shouldn't be moving forward on climate change. It's something we have to do. Almost everybody in the labor movement recognizes that. Certainly all the leaders do. And so, our job is to be for working people. And so in the broad array of statements you could imagine about the president's climate plan and the proposed rule by EPA. We feel it's sort of our role is to lay out the concerns of working people on how are we going to make this thing work so that people, can work with some dignity and retire with some dignity. And these are, to us, our guideposts about how to be successful as we do this.
Well, now let me ask you about that a little bit, because if that's the debate we're going to have about these jobs, and as you mentioned, this sets guidelines for the states, and let's face it, the states, at least half of them in this country, have not had a sterling track record of, for example, signing on to the Medicaid expansion and the Affordable Care Act or what have you. So would we be right in saying, for example, that struggle, that debate about making sure these are good jobs, decent jobs, and so on, is going to happen at the state level or the national level, or is it really going to have to be both?
I think it's going to have to be both. Of course, when you want to have struggles about the jobs that are being created and how good are they, you really, there are two ways to look at it. One is to look at sort of the national standards and, what do these jobs pay? How much value added is there? How much can the employer afford? And unions are very good at that. But the other side of that is, what's the community standard? What does the community think a decent job is that you need to live in that area? What does the community think the employer's responsibility should be if there are incentives given from the government? So the bottom-up approach from the states is going to be very important. But, making good jobs out of the jobs that are created is a fight we have to have at all sorts of levels. And I wish I knew the one, place we could push the button and make it happen. But unfortunately, it's a multi-pronged attack here.
Now, I'm wondering if in some way it isn't, instead of just a two-person discussion with the working people and the communities themselves, the union movement and the communities themselves talking about the kind of jobs that they want. I would argue that, and of course those two overlap, but I would argue that the environmental movement ought to be part of this conversation too, I guess I would say. And I know there's going to be some debate and some pushback. You talk to environmental folks and they will say, for example, there's no such thing as clean coal or whatever. So, I would think there would have to be all those parties kind of sitting around a bunch of tables around the country. And I'm wondering if, at all levels, and I'm wondering if you guys have any plans to make something like that happen.
Well, so we have been looking at what it takes to ramp up the state and local labor movement's involvement in these state implementation plans. But I think the facts on the ground are that we already have pretty good relationships with a number of environmental groups, especially the national environmental groups. The AFL-CIO has been working on some projects around methane with the Blue-Green Alliance. A number of AFL-CIO unions are in the Blue-Green Alliance, which is a sort of a natural spot for these discussions to occur. But, we've been talking about what it takes to do this successfully for a long time, and there's pretty wide support in the environmental community, maybe a little different emphasis given what their mission in life is. But, most environmentalists are pretty progressive folks, and I think they understand that, we do better when working families are doing better, and that's the sort of thing that will make the fight against carbon pollution work for everybody. And people are pretty readily grasp, that concern and where we're coming from.
Well, I guess, and the other piece of it you mentioned, you guys have brought up, and I think it's an important one, is the international, that this has to be done internationally too. So there's a lot we could discuss about that. I hope you'll come back at some point and talk with us again. And I'll just close by saying I did spend about a year managing a special project in Flint, Michigan, and so I have good memories of Flint. I lived down the road, down Route 23 a ways, so that my wife could be close to Ann Arbor University there. So say hello to my old state the next time you get down there, and thanks for coming on the show.
I really thank you for having the AFL-CIO on. This is going to unfold, over a couple of years, and there's lots to talk about. So I'm very happy that you're digging into these subjects. Thank you so much.
You bet. Thanks again, Brad Markell, who is Executive Director of the AFL-CIO Industrial Union Council. And we will be right back after this with more of the Zero Hour. And we are back on the Zero Hour. I thought we might talk in this segment about what's going on in North Carolina. The Reverend William Barber II, who we talked about a couple weeks back, great inspirational speaker, leader of the Moral Mondays movement, which is getting a lot of attention down there. And just for background, North Carolina has been dominated by kind of the worst elements of the right. The governor there and some other folks are very close with a very wealthy guy. They're spying on people who go to these Moral Mondays demonstrations. These Moral Mondays demonstrations have drawn a breadth of people. Reverend Barber tells an anecdote about being called to the whitest county in the mountains of North Carolina in order to talk to them about the Moral Mondays movement and a movement for a more just society, economically and socially. So he's getting some traction there. And the one thing you don't do in North Carolina is or used to not do is mess with a preacher. And of course, Reverend Barber is a preacher, but that's changing a little bit. I guess, well, we'll listen to a couple clips. They're running ads now. You got Republicans running for Congress, and let's just say that Reverend Barber is getting little attention. So let's play the first ad, okay?
Here's another example of broken politics.
Power drunk, immoral. They have attacked the poor and attacked the sick and attacked our children. Wrong. Lies.
That's foolishness. I'm Bruce Von Cannon. It's time to roll up our sleeves and go to work to cut spending and stop broken politics.
Bruce Von Cannon, conservative for Congress.
I'm Bruce Von Cannon.
Yeah, he's Bruce Von Cannon, and he approved this message. I'll tell you, that's ad number one. And of course, the clips he was playing were clips of Reverend Barber. And it's interesting because he says he tries to portray the Reverend as being politics as usual, when politics as usual does not usually involve a prophetic moral objection to a politics that represents the wealthy and not the people, which of course is what Bruce Von Cannon is running to perpetrate and increase. Let's hear the second ad.
Once the political rant starts, civil debate ends.
What a day! What a day! What a day!
That's pure posturing. But here's a simple fact. Republicans cut taxes and cut spending to create jobs. I'm Andy Wells.
Andy Wells, conservative, Republican for state senate.
What a day!
See, a couple things about this. First of all, because you're probably hearing this on the radio and you haven't seen these ads, I got to tell you, both of these guys look like the villains out of a Charles Dickens novel. They look like, they should have names like Mr. Pennypacker or Pincher or whatever. And, they're sour looking, they're mean looking, and needless to say, they are both Caucasian gentlemen. That should go without saying. But, and Reverend Barber is not. But we'll get to that element of this in a second, but a couple things strike me about these ads, and I think you'll probably feel the same way. One is they're really bad. They just don't work. I mean, when someone says that's politics as usual and then plays a clip which is anything but politics as usual, I can't believe that the good folks in North Carolina are going to go for that. And number two, when someone says that's grants, you know what he's trying to do? He's trying to do a Howard Dean on Reverend Barber. He's taking one clip where he shouts, "What a day," and make it look like he's a screaming crazy guy. And then he says that's grandstanding. But look, everybody in North Carolina knows what preachers do. They know what white preachers do. They know what black preachers do. So that's not going to work. So why are they running these ads if they're not very good? Could it be, now we're just speculating here, but could it be that what they're really doing, because remember, these are television ads, is reminding people that their political opponents are associated with and indirectly at least being helped by black people? Could that be what this is really saying? Look at this black man challenging us. Look at this black man saying he doesn't like what we're doing. Look at this black man getting people all excited and riled up. there's a history of that sort of thing in this part of the world. And, I have a lot of affection for North Carolina. I have a lot of affection for the South and its culture. But I'll tell you, we've seen this game before. And ask yourself, when this was going on in the 1960s, who won that battle? Was it Bull Connor, the sheriff? Was it Lester Maddox, the governor? Or was it Martin Luther King, the reverend? Was moral vision? Now, what are they really afraid of? Let's just hear a minute of what Reverend Barber had to say at the recent New Populism conference held by the Campaign for America's Future. This a couple weeks ago. Let's hear Reverend Barber if we can.
Prophetic moral vision seeks to penetrate despair so that new futures can be believed and embraced by us. Brueggemann goes on to say the prophetic moral vision does not ask if the vision can be implemented. So the first role, my role as a moral instrument in public policy, is not to ask, is not to sit around in every meeting and say, how are we going to do this in totality? Because the questions of implementation, says Brueggemann, are of no consequence until the vision can be imagined. You see, the slaves didn't get out of slavery first by figuring out how to get out. They got out by being driven by a vision that said, up above my head, I hear music in the air. There must be a God somewhere. Before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home with my Lord. They had a vision to get out before they figured out the practical ways to accomplish freedom. Imagination must come before implementation.
Imagination, he went on to say, must come before implementation. We need a prophetic moral vision. We need to restore the vocation of imagination. That's what these guys are afraid of, the vocation of imagination, the imagination of a world where their corporate monarchy no longer rules the United States, where people can earn a decent living wage, where we have a just society that's inclusive of all. That's what they're afraid of. I'm glad they're afraid. It shows it's working. And in the words of Reverend Barber, all I have to add is, what a day. I'm Richard R.J. Eskow, and we will be right back after this. This is The Zero Hour. And we are back on The Zero Hour. I'm Richard R.J. Eskow, and in this segment, we're going to hear a pre-recorded interview from Senator Sherrod Brown. The forces of corporate America are still hard at work trying to cut your Social Security and mine. They did it, there's this bipartisan delusion, or rather I would say agenda, because I'm not sure how much the delusion is shared and how it's a complicated issue. I reviewed Tim Geithner's autobiography or memoir last week, and Geithner buys absolutely into the idea that Social Security contributes to the deficit. He argues for it in his book, even though it's forbidden by law from doing so. This is part of a 20-30-year campaign to convince people that Social Security is no longer economically viable. We had that bipartisan effort to cut it, which wound up first with Republican proposals, and then the president, including the Jane CPI cut in his 2013 budget. Of course, that wasn't accepted. Under pressure, the president took that out, but that's not enough. We have an inadequate Social Security system, and it needs to be expanded. In the United States Senate, Sherrod Brown has been on the forefront of fighting to expand Social Security with what I consider a very modest proposal. There are more ambitious ones out there, but certainly it's a great first step, and it's a great message. And I think you'll appreciate this interview where Senator Sherrod Brown joined us to talk about why he fights for Social Security, why the Republicans are not likely to be allies in that fight, and what we have to do now and going forward. So here now, our pre-recorded interview with Senator Sherrod Brown on Social Security. Senator Sherrod Brown, you've been in the forefront of the fight in the Senate to expand Social Security rather than cut it, as was the popular proposal at least a year or two ago. Why, in your opinion, is this such a critical issue?
Well, it's a critical issue if you get out and talk to people. Pope Francis recently said to exhort his parish priests to go out and smell like the flock. And if members of the Senate, members of the House would go out and talk to real people about real needs, they'd see how important Social Security is, that it's for half of people in my state, more than half, and for half of the people in most states in this country, Social Security is the great part of their retirement income. And to think of adjusting the cost of living downward, it makes absolutely no sense. We need to think in Social Security not in terms of balancing the budget, but think of it in terms of pension reform and, most importantly, retirement security, because it really is all about retirement security for tens of millions of Americans.
And we've seen that retirement security dissipated by the erosion of corporate pension funds, the loss of wealth, and the housing crisis, and so on. Now, I like the Pope Francis quote, and one of the other advantages of smelling like the flock is that you become invisible to predators, which leads me to my next topic, which is the election, the upcoming election. The Washington Post reported on this issue, Social Security, and you and the burgeoning group of Democrats who are pushing to expand Social Security. And the sense is that this is, I guess the point of my question is, isn't this good politics as well as good policy? Wouldn't it be smart for other Democrats to join you, the ones that haven't, and push this effort with a 2014 election coming up and an off-season, an off-year vote that is predominantly older and so on?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Populism is always, to me, it's the right policy. Minimum wage, extending unemployment, fairer tax system, working on a trade policy that works for workers, enhancing, strengthening Social Security. All those play very well with the public. They also happen to be the right policy. And I urge my colleagues every day to speak out on things like minimum wage and to speak out on making Social Security stronger and a bit more generous to seniors in this country. I mean, with what you said, corporate pensions have declined, people's savings have declined. When wages are stagnant for 60, 70, 80% of the public, that savings is so very, very difficult. Even if you have a 401k, the chances are your employer, even if your employer matches it, and that's not nearly always the case, you're not making enough money in so many cases to put aside the amount of money you need to a week or a month or a pay period in order to build any kind of a nest egg that can withstand the inflation and all the other things that can happen to older people after they retire. And that's why I want to make sure that Social Security is much closer to the replacement value of where you were working, and more giving seniors a bit more of a fighting chance if they don't have the kind of savings that pensions used to give people.
Well, and what can we do to, we're obviously allies on this issue. I'm a senior fellow at Campaign for America's Future, which had the new populism conference last week. This show is sponsored by Social Security Works, which is working to expand Social Security. Your proposals, I would say, given the scope of the problem, are modest and moderate. How do we get more people on board? How do we get millennials to turn out to vote, given that there's this prevalence of belief among some millennials anyway, Social Security won't be there for me. That's been the propaganda line. How do we cut through the static and get a message out on this between now and November?
Well, it's the kind of work that you personally are doing, RJ. It's the kind of work that the Populist Conference did. It really is talking to people and organizing and getting seniors out, showing to tell their stories. It really is about telling their stories, because I hear some members of the Senate that are wealthier certainly than the average person in this country, that they're not cruel. They're not. I mean, some Democrats even that just say, well, to fix these entitlements, we need to do this. When they use the word entitlement, if they're using the word entitlement, you've got to be specific. Say, when Republicans say we've got to fix entitlements, what do you mean by that? Because it sounds good to fix entitlements. They're not sustainable, all that. But what do you mean? And what they mean is they want to cut Social Security. And the only way to beat this back is to be on the offense and explain that social insurance in this country is social insurance. You pay into it as you pay into Social Security, and you should get a decent benefit back in order to live a decent standard of living. And I think the more outspoken any of us can be, the stories we tell about how seniors trying to live on $1,100 or $1,200 or sometimes less per month in Social Security, how they struggled in 2 or 3 low-income jobs and haven't been able to put savings aside, didn't even have the chance for a 401k. Their pension was taken away a decade ago. That Social Security is really it, and the focus needs to be Social Security is not. You don't cut Social Security, balance the budget. You increase Social Security for people to have a decent standard of living and the retirement security they work towards for 40 years of their work lives.
Now you've been also in the forefront of the fight to restrain runaway growth and recklessness on Wall Street. And the reason why I bring that up, you've done great work in that area. We have discussions about raising the cap, as your bill would do, the payroll tax cap to get more revenue for Social Security. But there are a number of other proposals out there also for revenue for Social Security to expand the benefits. Estate tax or a financial transactions tax. What do you think about some of these longer term ideas for expanding Social Security even more?
Yeah, I think we look to, again, the debate has to be not about entitlements, not about balancing the budget, not about the, quote, unsustainability of Social Security, because that's not the issue. The issue is retirement security and how do we help seniors. And whether it's lifting the cap, whether it's another kind of a tax that the affluent can pay a little more easily, just asking them to pay their fair share when we've seen what hedge fund managers and so many have done. We've seen these inversions now, these corporations that sort of move overseas for tax purposes and basically to avoid taxes, and it's tens of billions of dollars. All those kinds of things we need in this public debate to show that, what do we do to help people with retirement security? What do we do to give people that have struggled their whole lives some kind of decent standard of living in the last 20 or 30 years of their lives?
Now, you've worked across the aisle on Wall Street reform. There's the Brown-Vitter bill on too big to fail banks. Any chance you can bring along any of your Republican colleagues in the fight to expand Social Security, or you think they'll be hopelessly troglodytes about this?
Well,
what do you think?
I think that the Republican way of thinking in Washington, Republican way of thinking is so they don't like Social insurance. They've tried to privatize Medicare over the last 20 years. The Bush administration, less than a decade ago, tried to privatize Social Security. They don't much like the role of government there, but that's where the public comes in. That's where, they still act like they like at election time Social Security and Medicare. They run, the congressman, some congressman's mother comes on, my son would never cut Medicare and Social Security. Well, actually, they did or tried. So but it's a question of organizing and getting people to speak out about this, that these two programs, Social Security and Medicare, have lifted a number of generations out of poverty, but still far too many people are right on the edge, and strengthening these programs means everything. But it really, the philosophy of the Republican Party of 2014 is they don't like any of these government programs, but they're going to listen to the public when elections happen and they realize that senior voters, frankly, didn't really buy their lines.
Now, last question, because I know you've got to go and vote in a minute. So my last question for you, you've also spoken up on Republican, what I would characterize as a Republican demonization of disabled Americans who are receiving SSDI or disability insurance under Social Security. Anything we can do to keep that on the screen between now and November, and for that matter, now and ongoing?
Yeah, they've tried to separate in the public's mind good social insurance, the retirement program, when they're not trying to dismantle it, but the good social insurance from bad social insurance, disability insurance, so they can win support for what they call structural reform. They claim it's going bankrupt. They claim it's rife with fraud. There is no real evidence of that. There are some fiscal financial problems, but we've done something a dozen times in the last 50 years in Congress. That's called a reallocation, where we don't increase taxes. We simply move money from other parts into the disability fund. So we can fix any of these issues, but Republicans are going to demagogue that issue. Coming up, you can always come up with a story of somebody that's abused something in a country of 320 million people, but we've got to fight back on that, because that program really matters to people. It hasn't been updated in a good while. People don't get enough assistance from it. People use it more in bad economic times because they're looking for any kind of help they can get, but we got to fight back.
Well, no more government by anecdote, I guess is the way to put it. Well, Senator
no more
Sherrod
government
Brown.
by anecdote, although we should be telling anecdotes on our side because people listen to anecdotes. People just understand they aren't necessarily factual when you add them up. And when I see some, when they use some poor soul that may have some way abused the system and use them as an example for everybody, clearly you got to push back.
Well, I appreciate that correction. And if we had more time, I would ask you how you keep your spirits up going in there each and every day fighting the good fight.
Because it matters and because so many people like you have our backs. That's how.
Well, thanks so much for doing that. And thanks so much for coming on the show. I hope we get to speak to you again sometime.
All right, we'll do it. Thanks, RJ.
Thanks so much, bye-bye. Senator Sherrod Brown.
This is The Zero Hour with RJ Eskow, produced by the We Act Radio Network in Washington, D.C., and broadcast across the nation. Visit us online at thisisthezerohour.com or at youtube.com/thezerohour. Ladies and gentlemen, RJ Eskow.
And we are back in the Zero Hour. We are back on the Zero Hour. We are back immersed in this critical moment in human history we call the Zero Hour, and in the second hour of our 3-hour program of the same name. In this hour, we will be talking with Politico reporter Ken Vogel about his new book on the Koch brothers and big money in politics. We'll be talking with organizer Ernie Powell about the new organization Senior Votes Count, which pushes back on some of the retirement issues we've been discussing. And I think you're going to enjoy the program. As you know, if you're a regular listener to the show, we like to peruse the news from time to time. And I want to remind you that if you send us a unique story that we use as a political metaphor, we will send you a prize yet to be determined, something silly and very, very cheap, because I'll be paying for it out of my own pocket. I don't know what it'll be yet. But as you know, we used a story recently from a member of my family. And that story was about an overweight circus accountant in Russia who fell and crushed, fortunately did not injure seriously, a circus crocodile, which of course is the perfect metaphor for our current Wall Street unrestrained, too big to fail banks. So good one. Send us one tweet it to us at either TZHRJ, which is the Zero Hour with RJ Eskow, or at RJ Eskow, that's RJESKOW, and we will send you a prize if we use it. Okay? Is that a deal? We got a deal? All right. Now, what else has been in the news lately? Well, this is one that if you know anything about finance and economics, nobody reported this. Quick story in the Washington Post. Debt, D-E-B-T, that's D-E-B-T, debt rises in leveraged buyouts despite warnings. Regulators urge banks to avoid such high levels of debt. Wall Street banks are financing more private equity takeovers with high levels of debt, despite warnings by regulators to reduce the amount of risky loans they make. Hey, what could go wrong? So there are two aspects of this story that I just briefly want to pull your coat about. One is that actually we've got too big to fail banks acting in a dangerous way. Hello. We've seen that before. And secondly, here's how it works. A private equity company, maybe Bain Capital or somebody else, borrows money to finance the purchase, and then they make the company they acquire assume that debt. So they don't have it properly. They don't have any assets to hold against it. So there's nothing to repossess if the thing goes wrong, except maybe the company they're buying, since that company owns the debt. But it's so over leveraged, it's so much in debt after it's done being bought that the world gets into trouble. It doesn't have the money. The bank defaults. Now, that's usually not a problem in this kind of go-go economy where we have a government of both parties who seems more concerned about keeping the stock market healthy. Then that doesn't happen. And by the way, this is one of the reasons they do that, because they know how unstable things are. But what happens if there's a financial crisis or an economic crisis of some kind? Why, then the whole house of cards falls down. So that's what we're up against, and they're doing it again. And there's another dimension of this I want you to think about, because we've seen this before with Bain Capital. I wrote a piece called Sick Money about Bain Capital's investments in the healthcare field, including pharmacy chains and homes for troubled teenagers and all sorts of things. If a healthcare company whose primary customers are Medicare, Medicaid, and the private insurance companies is so laden down with debt because of the way Mitt Romney and his ilk managed to take it private without putting any money in it themselves, here's what happens. Its executives, I've seen this in my own career in the private sector, the executives are under so much pressure to meet their earnings goals and pay off these debts that what we have, they're just much too tempted to engage in unscrupulous behavior. So we got to stop this, and we've got to do it now. And nobody's talking about it. That one bugs me. It bugs me a lot. In other news, there are still 2 vacancies on the board of the Federal Reserve. I wrote a piece for ourfuture.org and the Huffington Post saying Obama could appoint a People's Fed board, meaning a People's Federal Reserve. Look, you and I created the Federal Reserve, or our ancestors did, by an act of Congress more than 100 years ago. And it was the law, which empowers the existence of the Federal Reserve, says its Board of Governors appointments, quote, must yield a fair representation of the financial, agricultural, industrial, and commercial interests and geographic divisions of the country. In other words, they wanted a board of directors that represented the people as they existed at the time, and especially the people who would be affected by the behavior of the central bank. But of the 5 current members, because there are vacancies on the 7-member board, 3 are economists and 2 are lawyers. I would not call that a representative sample of the different sectors of the American public. The attorneys served as officials in the Clinton and Bush Treasury departments, respectively, while the economists are all associated with Northeastern institutions. So we don't have geographic diversity. Now, why did the law say that you had to have agricultural and industrial representation? Excuse me. Because in those days, you didn't have unions. So unions weren't, or not at the level we have them now. So unions weren't part of the equation. They should be. Industrial, it makes sense, but they're not. They're overrepresented at the local Fed boards, as are banks. So what does that leave? Agricultural. Remember, at that point, 30% of Americans lived on family farms. That's not true anymore. But we do need a representative Fed, and I'm going to stay on this because we do need a people's Fed. The people created it. It should serve the people. There are more stories, but these are the ones that really caught our eyes this week. That and the story that, once again, and we're going to talk about this on some future show, fashion photographers were caught photoshopping news pictures so that women were impossibly thin, literally impossibly thin. In one case, a woman's waist appeared to be smaller than her head. That's how much we're glamorizing extreme thinness and unachievable standards of beauty, which is all part of the process of keeping men and women on the hamster wheel of consumption, in this case, consumption of glamour and wealth. Welcome to America, 21st century style. Welcome to consumer slavery, 21st century style. I'm Richard R.J. Eskow. We will be right back after this. This is the Zero Hour. And we are back on the Zero Hour. With us now is Kenneth P. Vogel, who more popularly known around here as Ken Vogel of Politico, who tracks the confluence of money, politics, and influence for Politico, which is getting to be a larger and larger portion of our news cycle with every passing week, it seems. Ken has an ebook out available at such fine virtual vendors as Kindle and Nook and all those guys. But the book is called Big Money, $2.5 billion, one suspicious vehicle, and a pimp on the trail, and a pimp dash, I should say, on the trail of the ultra-rich who are hijacking American politics. Hey, Ken, thanks so much for coming back on the show.
Hey, great to be with you. It's my pleasure.
Yeah, well, thanks again. I must have been too easy on you last time or something.
We'll see if we can't correct that this time.
Listen, before we go any further, obviously people are going to want to know, and maybe you don't want to tip your hand. Okay, what's the suspicious vehicle and who's the pimp?
Sure. So the suspicious vehicle is actually my rental car that I drove to the hotel in Indian Wells, California, where the Koch brothers were having their annual big donor seminar, and they don't take too kindly to having reporters there, so they kicked me out, ushered me out to my car, and then reported the car as suspicious to the Riverside County Sheriff, who tracked me down later to figure out what this was all about. And I explained, I'm just a reporter, just trying to get information. And this is a challenge of getting information in this new big money political world where so much of the money is migrating to these secret, undisclosed vehicles where you don't know who the donors are, you don't know what their motivations are, and the only way you can really find out is by trying to sneak into their meetings, which is what I tried to do when my vehicle was reported as suspicious. It's actually also the sort of backstory behind the Pimp, who was a former police officer who was doing security for the Democratic Governors Association when they had their big fundraisers around the Democratic Convention in 2012 in Charlotte, North Carolina. One in particular that he threw me out of was this fundraiser at the Duke Mansion. It's this mansion on the outskirts of Charlotte where they had a number of Democratic governors and a string quartet playing and tuxedoed waiters serving fancy hors d'oeuvres. And this guy explained to me, this is important for these people to be able to meet in private and not feel like their safety is at risk. And I'm saying, I'm not threatening their safety. I'm just trying to figure out who is giving this money. And so this is the challenge that we face and that all the media faces and voters face in this new world, is figuring out who's giving the money and why.
Well, nothing says we're here to do the people's work like a string quartet and waiters in tuxedos. It's interesting. So the guy who probably called in your car as a suspicious vehicle was the Pimp, was the former Pimp in question, which is interesting because my first thought when you said that they did that, they called in your vehicle like that, is that was a dick move. So
right.
It all fits together. It really was, by the way. I mean, that's an extraordinarily nasty and petty thing to
and even
do.
the sheriff who ended up tracking me down said, they reported the vehicle as suspicious. I had to come out there and take a report, and I got the report through the California Freedom of Information Act, and he said he thought it was weird, and that's the word he used, that they wanted to report this vehicle as suspicious when it was no longer on the premise and didn't seem to pose any threat to them. So the sheriff's characterization is weird. Your characterization is it's a dick move. I probably wouldn't quibble with either of them.
I would also add that, maybe the difference between you and me, I don't know, is I might have asked whether filing a false police report it was a charge that might stick in a case like this. But I guess you do have to report on these people. But it certainly is, it shows us who we're up against. And listen, as to the content of the book itself, which is, it's a great topic because it's so important. You've said that members of this mega donor, here's one of your interesting points that it doesn't really, I haven't heard other people bring up in quite this way, which I appreciate. You say that at a time when wealth is increasingly coalescing in the richest 1%, etc., members of this mega donor community, this is you, I believe, talking, it's certainly not me, and the consultants who spur them on are wresting control from the political parties which once combined to rule politics with an iron fist. Now, I know that ticks off Democrats, a lot of Democrats, when you say that. I completely agree that the biggest problem, particularly at the national level, has been a kind of duopoly of these two parties who can agree on social security policy or military policy or whatever, and really the people don't have any alternative. They have to accept it. So now you're saying they're wresting control away from the party structure. And here's the part where I might have phrased it more differently, but you say in a perverse way the new system is more democratic, but only for those with the cash to buy in. Now, I know what you're saying, Ken Vogel of Politico. I know you're saying because we don't have this lock, right?
Yeah, there are, in a weird way, there are more players, and it's less control. The party had really exerted control over sort of the parameters of the debate, like you said, on social spending, on military spending, on some of the big issues that our government grapples with. It was the parties who controlled it, and sometimes they controlled it in a sort of public way through their debates of their platform committees, and sometimes it was, closed door, smoky backroom deals where they gave a bridge to a member of Congress to vote for a particularly controversial bit of legislation, but you kind of knew that these they would characterize themselves as the adults were controlling things, and now you don't have that, and you have all these folks who have a ton of money, and they're able to really determine what the issues are that are talking about and the parameters of the debate. The move by Republicans to the right on fiscal issues, the Tea Party wave, that's in large part due to some of these very wealthy donors who funded these Tea Party groups, and the result is not necessarily what they wanted. The result is not that the fiscal policy of the country is sort of shifting to the right and becoming sort of more austere. The result is gridlock and chaos, like what we saw with the government shutdown, but you can't argue with the fact that it is having a real, very tangible result, and it's a result that affects regular people. The shutdown, deprived people of including women and low-income women and children of their social services, and it deprived federal government workers of paychecks, and you could trace that in a pretty direct way back to these very wealthy conservatives funding these Tea Party groups.
Now, it's interesting, and you name a lot of them. One of the names you don't bring up a lot, and I'm just curious to see if you counter them a lot. One of the names I don't see a lot is in your writing is Pete Peterson. And Now Peterson's been around for 30, 40 years, and he's been, because you make a great point about how these guys can change the debate. In a sense, no matter who wins a given election, they can change the subject a lot. And we're not talking about, certainly not about public financing of elections or, other topics. Job creation is off the map. But we're talking about what they want us to talk about. But the master of that, in my opinion, and I think the kind of proto donor for everybody you mentioned in a way, but you may disagree, is Peterson, who for 30 years has been funding these conferences to focus everybody's attention on the national deficit to the exclusion of all other issues. I mean, it's an issue to deal with, but kind of making it primary above everything else, and especially cuts to Social Security and Medicare. Now, whatever you think of his agenda, he's been spectacularly successful. And is that just coincidental? Was he just the first to think of it, or is there no relationship between Pete Peterson and the guys you cover?
Well, what's interesting is he has mostly stayed away from the direct election spending. He's been more on the issue advocacy side, and I think it's increasingly difficult in this new environment to be effective when you're just on the issue side. Even the Koch brothers, they're an example. They like to think of themselves as driven by issues, including those that Pete Peterson cares about. And they, for years and years, had spent their money supporting libertarian think tanks and some of these wonkier groups that, if they did do public policy advocacy, did it in a way that was a little more green eye shades oriented and not getting into the electoral room. When they became really impactful is when they started spending that money, in some ways spending that money with the same motivation to shift the country to the right on fiscal policy, but they started doing it through elections and getting involved in elections with these big campaigns, grassroots and advertising campaigns, to get people to cast their vote on the basis largely of these fiscal issues, but they made it clear they wanted people to go and make this an issue at the ballot box. And Pete Peterson has done that less. But you're right; he certainly could have been included as sort of an early forerunner of this new type of donor.
Well, that's and that's a very interesting distinction, Ken. I'm going to want to talk, if you're willing to hang around for a couple minutes of ads. I got more to ask you about Big Money, the book, and Big Money, the topic, but I will warn you, since I've been too easy on you in the past, if you use the word impactful again on the 0 hour, there will be consequences. All right. Listen, thanks. So Ken Vogel, a political reporter for Politico. Please stick with us. We will be right back after these messages. I'm Richard R.J. Eskow, and this is the 0 Hour. And we are back on the Zero Hour. I am Richard R.J. Eskow, and with us still is Ken Vogel, political reporter for Politico, reporting on the intersection of big money and politics. His new book is Big Money, $2.5 billion, One Suspicious Vehicle and a Pimp. And Ken, there are a couple other great points in this book that I'd like to touch on. Maybe we can take them one by one. One is the chaos that these big donors create and their motivations, and then the way this has affected Democrats and consultants both. But let's take those topics one by one. You've made the point, which is also an important one, that these guys, at least on the Republican side, we've already seen they completely turned the primary system upside down. They kept Santorum, I think, and Gingrich for sure in, I guess, both those guys, and much longer than they would have stayed in otherwise. I guess number one question is, why would they do that? I think I know the answer, but I want to hear it from you. And two is, what are the implications for the future?
They did it because they think they know what works. They think they know politics, and that's sort of what motivates. I mean, obviously there's a passion element. They believe in these guys, but they also think that because they have been so successful in whatever their chosen fields are, in the case of the two examples that you mentioned, Sheldon Adelson is the guy who kept Newt Gingrich in the race for much longer than he otherwise would have been. Well, he made $40 billion on casinos, and in fact was really ahead of the curve, bucking conventional wisdom on Las Vegas. When Las Vegas was just a gambling town, he kind of decided, hey, I think there's a business here for conventions, and he plowed a lot of money into it. There were a lot of doubters. He was successful, and he made a ton of money. And then he went into Macau, the Chinese, the area of China where gambling is legal, and he spent a ton of money building casinos there. And people said, "Ooh, we're not sure if Macau is ready for these big, glitzy Vegas-style casinos." He was right again. His bets paid off there, and so he thinks, "Hey, I'm the smartest guy here. Don't tell me that Newt Gingrich can't be elected president. I'm going to prove you wrong again. I'm going to spend my money to support a super PAC that supports him, and he's going to win the Republican nomination, and he's going to win the presidency." Clearly, folks who study politics knew that wasn't going to happen, and they tried to convince him, hey, you're wasting your money, and even more than that, you're hurting your ultimate goal. You're undercutting the possibility that Barack Obama, the guy who you've identified as the worst president ever, can be defeated, and his pouring money into Newt Gingrich dragged out the primary, like you said, ended up hurting Mitt Romney, headed into the general election against Barack Obama, and may have actually helped reelect Barack Obama. But Sheldon Adelson wasn't going to be convinced that somebody else knew better than he did, because he thought, I get politics, and, like I said in the beginning, passion is key. I get politics, and I believe in Newt Gingrich. And so that drove what otherwise would have, appear through an objective analysis at the time to be a really bad set of spending decisions. But that's the new world in which we live. If you got the checkbook, it doesn't matter what the odds say. It doesn't matter what the political professionals say. You can really affect the way elections go.
I think that's exactly right. In my career, I've had a chance to meet a few extremely wealthy and successful business people, and I think you get it exactly right in terms of how they think. I think these guys really think, hey, to a certain extent, they may even, I'm not talking about Adelson specifically, but you might have a guy who in a way is kind of an idiot savant with certain money making, he has a gift, but he thinks that translates into every field of endeavor and nobody's going to tell him otherwise. That seems to me to be a spot on analysis, even as Gingrich got stranger and stranger.
Right. And the analogy that I draw is that it's not dissimilar from these guys who are super rich and super successful, whatever it is that they do, who happen to be sports junkies instead of political junkies, and they end up plunking down like a couple $100 million, or in the case of Steve Ballmer, who just bought the LA Clippers, $2 billion for a sports team, and they think, we'll see what Steve Ballmer does, but they think, hey, I made a ton of money at Microsoft or in hedge funds or whatever, and I think that same aptitude, that same skill set will apply to sports because I really like sports and I follow sports and I'm passionate about it, so I'm going to tell the GM, hey, you should pick this player. You should pick this quarterback. I'm going to tell the coach, hey, you might think about running this play. And the result is what we see here in Washington with the Redskins. Dan Snyder pretty much fits that bill, and the Redskins suck. And they just, it's like no matter what they do, no matter what big name players they buy, they're limited by this meddling from this owner who doesn't really have a clue, or certainly not as much of a clue as he thinks he does. And the result is often is backfiring.
Moneyball 2, the nightmare.
Right.
Absolutely. No, I agree. And the other piece of this, of course, and you mentioned this also, is that there are always consultants who see somebody with deep pockets and say, yeah, I'll play this guy's game. I'll tell him, yeah, this is what it would take for Newt to become the next president of the United States. And by no matter how bizarre Newt gets, they're going to, I called him Dr. Strange, but that was just me. So these consultants are part of this new kind of mega donor ecosystem too, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, you're exactly right, RJ. They're not going to tell these mega donors no. And this new system, it's a cottage industry. And in order to be successful at it, you need to keep the checks coming to your group or your campaign or your candidate. And so when the mega donor tells you, and this is an actual example with Foster Friess, who was the guy who kept Rick Santorum in the race alongside Newt Gingrich as the race sort of became more and more strange and less good for Republicans, he was giving money to the super PAC that was supporting Rick Santorum, and he said, I think we really need to do ads on Islamo-fascism and the threat of Islamic extremism. And this is like in New Hampshire, like the New Hampshire voters, they don't care about that. That's not they care. I mean, and to the extent that they do, it's far, far down their list of priorities behind jobs and behind health care and even Obamacare. But yet the Rick Santorum Super PAC ads were talking about the threat of Islamofascism, because nobody was willing, none of the consultants who were running this super PAC, who were making money off this super PAC, who were raising their profile off this super PAC, were willing to tell Foster Friess, maybe we should do ads about Obamacare instead.
Right. And Foster Friess should have learned his lesson after Batman defeated him in that movie. But,
right.
I'm not the first guy to make that comparison. I know. I'm sorry about that. But, and we've been talking about the Republicans the whole time, Ken Vogel of Politico, but we've also got the Democrats. You mentioned, being thrown out of a very classy party. You can now say I've been thrown out of better joints like this and say it truthfully. What about the Democrats and big money? They're shifting, they're moving, right? I mean, we got Hillary coming up, and she knows how to play the big money violin as well as anyone on earth, I think. But beyond that, the Democratic Party is shifting. And what are your thoughts on that?
That's exactly right, and that's where the potential for this big money to have the biggest impact is when there's no leader at the top of the party. There's no president who's running for re-election, or there's no nominee for president. And so the fight is both to determine which candidate is going to represent the party, but even more so, which direction the party is going to take. And so that's where you have the biggest difference. I mean, that's where you have the biggest differences in the Democratic or Republican base generally, but that's where you have the biggest potential for a single billionaire or a small group of multimillionaires to get together and put a lot of money behind a candidate who may not be representative of what the party thinks of as its highest and best ideals, or frankly of its most electable mainstream ideals, and get that candidate in the mix and potentially get that candidate the nomination. That's where you have the potential of a Democratic version of a Sheldon Adelson supporting a challenger to Hillary, who all the party leaders think is the best and most viable candidate in the general election. Well, all it would take is one billionaire with the willingness to write 7 or 8 figures behind Elizabeth Warren, or a more, just a more populist, progressive candidate, and you already see that there's the will there for that in the Democratic Party, that there's an audience there for a message that is to the left of Hillary's. Well, maybe a candidate could have emerged and caught fire among the Democratic progressive base on their own, but it certainly wouldn't hurt if they had a couple sugar daddies behind them. Then you could see the real challenge to Hillary take shape in a way that I think Democratic Party leaders would prefer it did not.
Yeah, although it may be that the base would be happy with that, we don't know, as you say. But do you see any possibility of characters out there who might fit that bill, who might step in and say, "Yeah, I'll write a Liz Warren or a Bernie Sanders, or pick somebody else. I'll write a left Democrat big checks."
Yeah.
And
I
do you?
do see that, and I see it, and it's on progressive. It's sort of on economic populism issues. Raising the minimum wage, cracking down on the banks, the things that we think of Elizabeth Warren as sort of being diverging from Hillary and maybe some of the more centrist Democrats on. But it's also on environmental issues. Barack Obama was supposed to be the great champion. He was going to, lower the sea levels or whatever his quote was. When he was accepting the nomination, and a lot of progressive Democrats for whom that is a top issue. Even now that Obama is doing some executive action late in his midway through his second term to address carbon emissions and climate change, they're really dissatisfied. And Hillary Clinton has not been a superstar in the eyes of many of these environmental activist Democrats, and so you have folks like Tom Steyer, the retired San Francisco hedge fund billionaire, who's talking about spending $50 million of his own money supporting candidates who support cap and trade or other, what are regarded by Republicans and certainly potentially by some swing voters as really aggressive solutions to combat climate change. Well, if Tom Steyer is willing to do that in 2014 in the midterm elections, who's to say he wouldn't be willing to spend $100 million supporting a challenger to Hillary Clinton who's a little more aggressive on environmental issues? And that's where you have the potential for a real chaotic primary.
Well, that's very interesting stuff. And Ken, do you imagine that any of these left-leaning billionaires might want to invest in a progressive and populist-oriented radio show with a charming and charismatic host?
I mean, that actually has been something that in the past there has been some support for, as you know, among the Democratic millionaires and billionaires, but for whatever reason, they haven't continued to support, things like Air America in the way that they were talking about doing, and the money hasn't materialized. So there's this debate, and now, you'll add another thing to the sort of list, the buffet of options for them to spend their money on. They could give it to a super PAC and support an individual candidate in a way that they couldn't back during the Air America days, but you're right that affects the political debate, and perhaps it may be even a more long-term way than a given super PAC in a given election.
Well, it's fascinating stuff, and thanks so much for coming on the show and talking about it with us. Kenneth Vogel of Politico. His new book is Big Money, $2.5 billion, One Suspicious Vehicle and a Pimp. He was on the trail of the ultra-rich who are hijacking American politics. Ken, as always, thanks for joining us.
Hey, my pleasure.
I'm Richard R.J. Eskow, and we will be right back after this with activist Ernie Powell about senior votes count. This is the Zero Hour. And we are back on the Zero Hour. In this segment, we'll be talking with my good friend Ernie Powell, who is, in his current role, is co-founder of a new organization called Senior Votes Count. Ernie started his career working with Cesar Chavez and the Farm Workers Union. He was grassroots national director at NCP-SSM, which is the National Committee to Protect Social Security and Medicare. He was handling public policy issues for AARP in their California office as senior advocacy manager for quite a while. He's been an activist for a while. He's a great guy, good friend of the show, and we're glad to have him back. Ernie, how are you doing?
Richard, so good to hear your voice and so good to be on your show.
Well, and
I'm doing well.
Glad to hear it. And you're doing well, and you're doing some work, too, and we want to hear about it. You have a new organization you're involved with called Senior Votes Count. Tell us about that, if you would.
Senior Votes Count is an organization that will unique from all other senior advocacy groups because what it will do is become intricately involved in congressional and Senate races by endorsing candidates and campaigning very proactively for those candidates. And the candidates we intend to endorse, we will endorse, will be people who are just straight up in support of Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. They will need to oppose any and all ideas of privatization, cuts to those programs, using Social Security, funding around the deficit. We will be opposing ideas such as Simpson-Bowles and other bad ideas. And so the candidates that we endorse and actively raise money for, actively help to get volunteers for, and use our collective voice as older voters will be those candidates that have those kinds of ideas and platforms. And it stands apart from most other senior organizations. ARP, as you indicated, I worked with ARP for 19 years, is a good advocacy group, but they are nonpartisan. During the election cycle, they present both sides, and they have voter guides and candidate forms. We will take a different approach. We will proactively look for good candidates. We like to call ourselves, we will be modeled very much after a very successful organization that fights on behalf of women's issues, Emily's List, and they actively recruit and secure good candidates for their issues around reproductive rights and other good issues for women. So we're just getting off the ground. We have not formally rolled out. We have a website that is literally a week old. It's www.seniorvotescount, and we're very excited and very enthused.
Well, that's great. And you know, what's interesting about this to me is, as you know, because we've talked about this, we've both seen a lot of the polling on issues like Social Security and Medicare. And in any given election year, I think probably, especially for off-year congressional elections, but in every election, these issues, this is an organization of senior voters to maximize, as I understand it, to maximize the impact of senior voters and the issues they care about. But those same issues are issues that the entire electorate cares about. And so if you're pushing people, for example, to expand Social Security benefits rather than cut them, to protect Medicare benefits and so on, you're really pushing candidates who, whatever fundraising challenges they may have or whatever, they're more likely to be adopting positions that are popular with the electorate, I would say. Am I onto something?
By very solid numbers. Yes, you are. Yes, you are, Richard. And by very solid numbers, the public supports Social Security, and they support the expansion of Social Security. The public supports Medicare. The public supports Medicaid, including the expansion of Medicaid in those states that have chosen not to go along with the Affordable Care Act and expand the coverage for Medicaid. And so those are the standards by which we will work, and the standards by which we will recruit and support candidates and oppose those that disagree with those ideas. And as you said, the public, I mean, I've seen many polls in recent years that say that the public is solid on that. So what we intend to do is just move that bar. Make sure that people over the age of 65 who vote in higher percentages are aware of our endorsed candidates' positions, and then work to get out the vote. The very, very important, one of the very important factors in Senior Votes Count is that not only we will be very proactive. We will train speakers bureaus in target districts and target states on the issues within the context of a campaign. We will equip voters with as many good messages by studying the polling numbers and developing really solid, succinct, and to-the-point messages for people who are fighting for certain candidates. So, yeah, it's consistent with what the public wants across the board, and we're very excited about this. We go ahead. I'm
sorry to cut in, but and so you're going to be helping candidates with messaging and with, I assume, money. And I guess my next question for you is: are you going to get involved in primaries as well as general elections?
Not at this stage. California just finished its primary this week, and of course other states have. At this stage, we don't anticipate that. We're going to be working in a select set of races in 2014 for the general election, And then as we grow and as we build, we'll see how we can expand our engagement. But that's sort of an open question at this stage.
All right, well, that's fair enough. But where I come from is I like to see some primary challenges to people who are ostensibly Democrats but aren't fighting for Social Security. But hey, that's just me. And so I know people can go to seniorvotes.com to learn more about this initiative. But just in our last 30 seconds or so, what are you guys going to do to communicate the message about this program and try to recruit membership?
Well, anyone who contributes can be a member, or anyone who signs up to get on our mailing list or our email list can be a member. And you can do that by going to www.seniorvotescount.com. We encourage people to do that. The site, as I said, is up for less than a week, and it's still in development, but it's there, and we want to use it as an early means to build. We're also going to be doing house meetings, public forums in all over the country, and recruiting volunteers and spokespersons as we're growing, as we build. So people really like this idea, and we're excited about this opportunity.
Well, and I like the idea too, so we'll have to have you back on to talk to us more about it. Ernie Powell, activist organizer, talking about Senior Votes Count. Ernie, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure, and thank you, Richard.
I'm Richard R.J. Eskow, and we will be right back after this on the Zero Hour.
This is The Zero Hour with RJ Eskow, produced by the We Act Radio Network in Washington, D.C., and broadcast across the nation. Visit us online at thisisthezerohour.com or at youtube.com/thezerohour. Ladies and gentlemen, RJ Eskow.
Well, welcome back to The Zero Hour. And okay, there are a couple stories that I really wanted to share with you. You know, as I keep telling you, we interpret what's going on in the world sometimes through the craziest stories. Okay, but we have fun that way, and that is sometimes how we view the world. So, okay, two stories I wanted to share with you. Oh, did I tell you this is the Zero Hour on We Act Radio, and that we have the able and brilliant Pete Callahan and Troy Miller manning the operation? Do not allow me to forget to do that. And do not allow me to forget that if you have a strange science or other story you want to share with the Zero Hour, if we pick it and use it, we will send you a prize that I have not picked yet, but it will be cheap because I'm paying for it. Okay. First story is from New Scientist, 6 Legs Tasty. This is the headline, 6 Legs Tasty, which is a reference to, by the way, to the H.G. Wells story, The Island of Dr. Moreau, 2 legs good, 4 legs bad. Remember? You might not. Okay. 6 Legs Tasty, first edible insect farm opens in the United States. Okay, here we go. I'll just give you a few things from it. A twitching mass of European house crickets clings to a maze of meshed cardboard in a tent about the size of a minivan. They're in their new home, an abandoned warehouse in Youngstown, Ohio, where they will prosper until being killed, ground into flour, and baked into cookies and tortilla chips. These are the first insects in the U.S. to be farmed for human consumption. Big Cricket Farms, the company running the warehouse, is working with insect food startup 6 Foods in Boston, who will make the cricket chips, which they call chirps. Oh, lovely. And cookies. They are among many adventurous eaters hoping to carve out a niche for a protein-rich, environmentally friendly food source that could transform the modern diet. Okay, that's number 1. That's the insect farm that's been created. Number 2 story, also wacky and random, that we're going to give for you, and then we'll tell you how we tie them together. The Hidden Cash Millionaire. This is a story from a local Los Angeles paper. Hidden Cash Millionaire causing pandemonium in Los Angeles. The mysterious millionaire who hid cash in random places in San Francisco, is now causing chaos at a Los Angeles area beach after surreptitiously, quote unquote, donating his money there too. On Saturday, the purported middle-aged real estate developer, I don't know how they know that, announced on his Twitter account, hidden cash, that he stashed 36 Angry Bird toys filled with cash around Hermosa Beach, California, an oceanfront city just south of Los Angeles for anyone to find. He says, and here's what this guy says. Hermosa Beach, between the pier and the volleyball, and that's to your left as you face the ocean. Remember, dash, there are 36, exclamation point. Go, dash. You know what? Here's a question for the audience. Do you hate this guy as much as I do? I mean, how obnoxious is that? Because he says he's a millionaire, but we're not talking about like mad stacks, okay, here. We're not talking about $10,000. Some of the toy birds reportedly, and they found some, one person on Twitter said, it's pandemonium here in Hermosa. Not all birds have been found yet. People running every direction. Helicopters are flying overhead. Some of the toy birds, according to this article, contained as much as $180. $180? This guy says he's a millionaire and he's having people humiliate themselves and run around the world for $180. Now, it's possible this is a stunt, possible this is a reality TV show or whatever, but this guy's gone to various cities, San Francisco, now Los Angeles, says he's going to go to New York City next. Now, what can we conclude from these two stories? Because remember, we try to conclude something. One is that the oligarchs who are running our economy and our political system are going to make it very expensive to eat regular food pretty soon, and we better be thinking in terms of alternatives. I know. Other cultures eat all sorts of things, and, you know, I swear when I was growing up, I couldn't mention a cockroach without my mother saying, you know, in some cultures, they're considered a delicacy. Right, I know they're considered a delicacy in some cultures. And you know what? Flies consider dog droppings a delicacy too. That doesn't mean I have to share that particular opinion. I think bugs are icky. So what can we conclude about this? And then we got this hidden millionaire guy, or whatever he's calling himself. Hidden cash is his Twitter acronym, although I shouldn't tell you that because then people will, I'm encouraging him. But what can we conclude from this? I guess that they're creating an economy and a society for us where we're going to have to eat bugs and humiliate ourselves for small amounts of cash from the ultra wealthy. Is that the kind of country you want to live in? Is that the kind of world you want to live in? It's not the kind, even if bugs are your favorite food, I'm going to argue that's not the kind of world we should want. We should be fighting against it. That's why we have an independent political movement. That's why we're concerned about the future. That's why we're fighting to change things. I'm Richard R.J. Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour. And we are back on The Zero Hour. I'm Richard R.J. Eskow, and with us now to talk about the politics of the Silicon Valley is our friend Yasha Levine, who is a roving reporter for PandoDaily. He used to edit the Exile, which good writers everywhere appreciate. He's co-founder of the Shame Project and author of The Corruption of Malcolm Gladwell. You know, I got a whole like stack of Malcolm Gladwell commentary. We'll have to talk about that book sometime, but thanks for coming on the show, man.
Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure.
So listen, you've been all over this story of Khanna running for Congress, and I want to talk to you about that a little bit, because the last time we talked, first of all, the primary hadn't come yet. Secondly, you hadn't written a couple pieces that are interesting. One was about some of the companies behind him. I guess you wrote it 16 days ago. Wondering whether it's the end of the road for dirty politics in terms of his campaign. And then you have this other piece, which is really interesting, which is partially titled Rut Row, which I thought was pretty funny. Scooby-Doo reference there, how the Valley's favorite politician may be foiled by a Hindu supremacist banned from the U.S. And of course, since you wrote that, they've had the primary. So Mike Honda, the Democratic incumbent, did far better than Khanna, but they're going to face a runoff, right?
Yeah, no, he moved in. He got the second, highest number of votes in California's new two-top primary. So he went on. Either going to go on and face off in the general election in November. It's going to be interesting.
Yeah, it's going to be very interesting. I was trying to figure out, Khanna spent a lot of money to get into second place, a lot more, I think, than Mike Honda did. And I was trying to figure out if that was true and what the cost difference per vote might have been for those two guys, but I never got very far with that.
To be honest, I don't have the campaign numbers. I think he spent much more. I think maybe even a 2-to-1 ratio. Don't quote me on that 100%, but he spent a lot. I think he's done somewhere close to $2 million, I want to say, to get where he is. In fact, I can pull it up right now. He spent $3 million, actually. $3 million, the campaign. And so he's going to have to raise a lot more money, And as I understand, Mike Honda didn't, spend a minimal amount of campaign funds on the primary election because they were pretty confident that they were going to get, past the primary at least. So, with a comfortable margin. So the campaign didn't really try to buy too many campaign ads or do any fancy campaigning stuff and save their money for the general election. But Roe, in order to get, in the end, he got 21% of the vote, had to spend millions to get that vote. And he was almost, he almost lost to a Republican candidate who no one, who just appeared just a few months before the election and no one knew who she was. And she got 17% and spent a couple $100,000. So it was an uphill struggle for him to get any kind of recognition from voters.
And just so our folks can have some background, if they haven't heard you and I talk about this before, or haven't read your reporting on it, Mike Honda is a kind of mainstream progressive Democrat. Seems like a good guy. Khanna, who doesn't have a lot of political background, has the backing of, as you put it, the richest and most powerful plutocrats in Silicon Valley. And he's got mega wealthy donors. And, we talked about him the first time I was interested in him. It's because he's such a reflection in my mind of this culture that believes that, Silicon Valley technology is disruptive and innovative and should their philosophy and way of doing things should be applied to politics because it's so creative and new. When as a former tech guy myself and as somebody, just observer of culture, I think they're unimaginative in the large part, freeloading off publicly created technologies like the internet and, move fast and break things, says Mark Zuckerberg, but Facebook is crap. So, but these guys somehow think, and I'm talking from a technological perspective, among other things. So these guys think they're brilliant and creative. Khanna reflects that culture. And even in the Silicon Valley, it seems when it comes to the electorate, maybe not so powerful, huh? I mean, not so popular, I should say. Yeah.
Well, it's a problem, because there's a disconnect in the press frequently when they say, Khanna has the backing of Silicon Valley. So, what that really means is he has the backing of Silicon Valley billionaires and Silicon Valley's investor class for the most part, and he does, and he has broad support from them. I mean, and it's not, it's a bipartisan, tripartisan support. Democrats, Republicans, even libertarians support Khanna, a Democrat, and so I think with him, he is a more of a corporate version of Mike Honda. He can't actually say anything about what he disagrees with Mike Honda. He doesn't really have any alternative political plans or proposals really that he can point out and talk about. It's an answer that he can't. It's a question that he can't answer. Like, how are you different than Mike Honda? He can't say. But he's a more corporate version of Mike Honda, a younger, more corporate version of him, and so he's willing to I think, listen much more closely to what to what these companies want and what these billionaires want, and what they really want are, basically a tax holiday so they can repatriate their, offshore profits that they're hoarding overseas. The district is home to Apple and eBay, and Apple is one of the biggest hoarders of, has just tens and tens of billions of dollars just stashed overseas that it doesn't want to bring into the country because it doesn't want to get taxed at the corporate tax rate. And so, he's much more willing to give Silicon Valley what they want on a lot of issues. And he's just, he called himself a fanboy of Silicon Valley. He's just willing to do whatever they want him to do. And so I think the excitement for this candidate that's coming from Silicon Valley's investor class, is not really because he's forward thinking or has these incredible political proposals or political vision of any sort. I think that they understand that he just would be a much more eager representative of their interests in DC. And I think
what's his background, Khanna? Where does he come from? What does he know?
Yeah, well, he spent some time at the Commerce Department under Obama, a couple of years, and he's a lawyer. He's an intellectual property lawyer, law attorney, and that's basically his experience. He says he has experience, working with Silicon Valley as an attorney, and that he has experience working in government in the Commerce Department. So, he doesn't really have much experience. He's never held elected office. So he's tried to run for a couple of congressional seats. One other time, not a couple, but one other time, and he failed. So yeah, he doesn't have much experience, and that allows him to sort of be this blank slate that people can project whatever they want, or whatever they want to see in him. They see, but he's really a very uninspiring politician. If you meet him face to face, I can't say that Mike Honda is inspires really greatness in you or some kind of, Mike Honda is kind of a bore, a little bit, but he's not radical in any way, but he has the right positions on a lot of issues. And, when it comes down to it, like if you're a Democrat and you're going to primary a fellow Democrat and try to take a spot, there has to be a good reason, a big reason, an important reason, right, to do it. And if there isn't, if Rouhani couldn't name a single thing that he disagreed with Mike Honda about, he couldn't name a single vote that he would have done differently.
Yeah, and see, to me, what's interesting about Rouhani and this whole thing is, again, because I'm interested in the culture of these Silicon Valley billionaires who increasingly influence our political and economic lives. So it's not just the race, although the race is interesting. It's what it tells us about these guys, and they are all guys, and the billionaire bro culture of Silicon Valley. And, I guess he got them all excited. You wrote this sentence. Is it Rowe promised his mega wealthy donors that he'd use Silicon Valley culture to disrupt national politics. They love that word, disrupt, and make the world a better place. It would be Washington, D.C. 2.0. These are all the vacuous, vacant, empty buzzwords that these guys pat themselves on the back over and over again. It's just, hey, we're disruptive, we're transformative, we're 2.0. Well, 2.0, by the way, that release came out in 1997, so they should be saying 8.0 by now. But that aside, isn't this basically kind of the guys who are funding them are just being narcissistic to a certain extent?
Well, yeah, and they are, but I think there's a bigger issue, a bigger thing at play here, a bigger force or a movement, and that is, these guys this is like a new oligarchy that's being minted right in front of our eyes, right? Look, some of these companies have barely existed for a decade, right? And so, but all of a sudden there's all these billionaires around, and I think they're beginning to awaken, right? And I think we're just seeing the kind of the first wobbly step that they're taking. In terms of politics, in terms of not only backing their own candidates and backing people who they see as representatives of their interests. Not representatives of necessarily the working class or just your average citizen of the Bay Area, but actually representing their interests specifically and primarily. And I think we're going to be seeing a lot more of this in Silicon Valley, and we're also going to be.
Well,
seeing
I want to
more
talk to you. Yeah, and I do want to talk to you more about this, about what this portends for the future, as well as some of the trouble that Khanna might be in, and some of the ways in which his past has kind of surfaced up, including possibly a connection to a frightening demagogue who has just been elected to high office very far away. So this is an interesting, fascinating story. Please stick with us and Yasha Levine, and we'll talk more about this in the second segment. I'm Richard R.J. Eskow, and this is the Zero Hour. And we are back on the Zero Hour with Yasha Levine, our good friend from PandoDaily, talking about the race in California's 17th district and the Silicon Valley tech communities, you might call him robo-candidate, Khanna. It's crazy. Wow, man. It's just such an interesting story in and of itself, not just the culture, but this race has turned out to be, so there was this, I don't know what the latest is, but first there was an accusation of dirty politics where people felt that one of the things I'm sure he promised his backers was Khanna is belongs to the South Asian community, a good voting bloc in that district. Probably promised he could bring them. All of a sudden, a Republican steps into the race. Now, with California's open primary system, a Republican can run away. Here in the very progressive, or very Democratic anyway, 33rd district, a Republican came in first among 12 candidates because the Democrats and progressives all split the vote. So all of a sudden, this Republican comes in. She's from the same community. And then, what do you know? There are several other Republicans jump into the race after she's perceived as a big threat to Khanna, and might be a connection to the Khanna campaign. Last we heard, any update on that?
Well, no. I think there's nothing conclusively proven, but there are a lot of serious questions, and the evidence does not want to go away because it's. I'll just briefly outline it. Essentially what happened was when this Republican candidate entered the race a few months before the election, she really spooked Khanna because she would be guaranteed as the sole Republican on the ballot, on the primary ballot, she would be guaranteed somewhere around 25% of the vote, just because that's the number of estimated number of Republican voters there.
Sure.
And so it was really bad because she would have gotten second place in the primary, which would bump down Roe to third place, which would basically not allow him to move on to the general election. And so what happened, right after that, something very suspicious. Two Republican candidates, registered at the very last possible minute. And became candidates. And then when someone started looking through their candidacy papers, something very surprising happened. They realized that a lot of the people who were circulating the candidacy petitions for these candidates, basically, taking a piece of paper around to residents of this district and asking if they would be willing to sign this piece of paper that would get this person on the ballot. Well, those people who were carrying those around were Khanna donors and supporters. In one case, there's this one woman who collected a third of all the signatures required to get one of these candidates on the ballot, and she was a Khanna supporter, a Khanna donor. There are articles printed in the local Indian American press showing her next to Khanna at campaign events, and so it was very surprising that this would happen. And so, of course, but there's nothing conclusive. Nothing was proven conclusively, and everyone, is like, there was just like kind of a lockdown. Nobody would talk about it. But there's a lot of, disturbing pieces to this story that point to some kind of collusion. Not directly necessarily to Khanna himself, right? But to the people around him.
All right, and you have a local Republican Party official, Jeffrey Wald, you reported, filed a lawsuit. Did that go anywhere?
Well, yes, one of the yes, there were two candidates. The lawsuit succeeded in getting one of them thrown off the ballot, but not because of any kind of conspiracy or dirty tricks, but because there were some inconsistencies with several of the signatures, which which basically he prevented. He didn't have enough signatures to get on the ballot because those weren't validated, and there wasn't nothing nefarious about that. It was just there were just some mistakes.
Right. So there's no. It didn't.
The judge didn't want to essentially hear these accusations because he said, "Look, where there's no time, there's just these people are not here. The candidates couldn't make it to court for whatever reason." And he said, "Look, we'll let the ballot decide because I don't want to hastily just throw people off the ballot just because there's some accusations." And he just would refuse to even hear the evidence. So the court really never ruled on it. They just kind of threw it out essentially.
All right. So maybe in the words of the old Dylan song, he can't help it if he's lucky. But in fact, that did divide, or it appears to have divided, the Republican vote. Vanilla Singh, who was that original candidate who looked to gain 25% of the vote and come in second, did not. Khanna came in second. He's going on to the final election. She is not. And in another totally unexpected, at least by me, twist to this story, a lot of people have been concerned worldwide and in India by the election of the new Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, who has been associated with very inflammatory anti-Muslim rhetoric and is known as a Hindu supremacist, banned from the U.S. for his rhetoric while a governor when there were horrific acts of violence against the Muslim minority, et cetera, et cetera. Modi is the new Prime Minister of India. Is there a Khanna connection there?
Yeah, well, there's a connection to the district, I'd say, more than Khanna. There's definitely a connection, but it's more of it's an issue to the district because the 17th California 17th Congressional District is the second. It's the one of two Asian majority districts, and it has the highest population of Indian Americans in the country, and so naturally, this district would involve Indian politics because there are just so many people from that country, or they're second generation sometimes Indian Americans, and so Modi became this kind of underlying issue that nobody really wanted to talk about, but it was skewing and it was sort of behind the scenes, sort of moving the election and influencing the election, and that was an unexpected aspect to this campaign, which almost got no reporting. There's no national media reporting of this at all.
And there's another connection too, which you mentioned or touch on certainly, and reporting of Mark Ames, also Pando and the Exile touches on this as well. That Modi, who at one point might have been considered the David Duke of Indian politics, has gone mainstream and is pushing economic reforms, quote unquote, of the neoliberal variety, promising to open up India's lucrative market, your words, to Western high-tech companies like eBay and Google, and big tech, meaning Silicon Valley big tech, supports Modi right back. So there's also this connection where maybe some of the same people who are backing Khanna for Congress, maybe in the hopes of tax breaks as well as for ego purposes, are also supporting a very extremist politician, in my opinion, in India. So there's that connection too, right?
Yeah, I mean, there definitely is. Exactly. There are some overlapping issues here, but as far as the Indian angle here played into the electoral politics here, because you have what's interesting is that the South Asian community there and the Indian American community there it's not monolithic, right? So there's actually half of the population, the Indian American population, is Muslim, and half of it is Hindu. And so, of course, Modi is a divisive, figure in the community because he is implicated in these really just horrific basically a kind of an anti-Muslim riot that happened in 2002 under his watch. It was just there was several thousand people killed, several 100,000 Muslims displaced in his state, and there was
about 250,000, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly, and they still are displaced, and they were ghettoized and live in sort of perpetual fear of violence, and it was really horrific. I mean, people were hacked apart. Pregnant women had their fetuses slit open in some cases. Not their fetuses, but their bellies split open, their fetuses thrown out, and burned. I mean, it was just the most horrific. It's almost impossible to imagine this kind of stuff happening.
And Modi's comments and. In addition to accusations that Modi might have been deliberately slow, unproven, we should say, that he might have told the police to wait a while before involving themselves and so on. We do know the police were very slow to step in, but unproven allegations that Modi, for example, said, well, let the people get their frustrations out and all that. But his comments afterwards were certainly appalling in their insensitivity, to say the least, to put it mildly. And so now you've got this issue of this appalling politician with connections to both the community. And by the way, neither you or I would want to in any way stigmatize any community in this country or in that district. But you don't just have those political issues within the community there in the Silicon Valley, but you have the political connections between the big tech companies that are supporting Khanna, who have been at best tone deaf to the implications of what it means to be cozy with Modi, and at worst capitalizing on it for their own personal profit. I guess as a closing comment, is that fair or not fair?
That is very fair. That is very fair, and I think that Modi. In the district, I think, was much more of an electoral issue. So that it was about trying to woo segments of the community and to get their votes, especially because Mike Honda has been a Modi critic and supported banning Modi from entering the U.S. And so Khanna tried to use that as a wedge issue to distance himself from Honda and to show the community that he's more on the side of the Indian American community. He's not like Honda, who is completely tone deaf to their needs,
I guess, Yasha, I guess we'll have to leave it there. But what that suggests to me is that he's not above a little bit of demagoguery too. So I know you'll stay on this story between now and the general election, and I hope we get to talk to you about it again and other things we could talk about too, Ukraine and other things. But as always, thanks so much for coming on the show, Yasha Levine.
Always a pleasure. Thanks a lot.
Take care. We will be right back after this. I'm Richard R.J. Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour. And in this segment, we are back on The Zero Hour. First of all, I should reiterate that. That's part of my job. But this is The Zero Hour. I am Richard R.J. Eskow, and we are here in this final segment to talk about something very important, a movement that I hope will be followed up on shortly called Reset the Net, excuse me. And with us to talk about that is Evan Greer, who's a campaign manager for Fight for the Future, a great organization doing a lot of work in the tech field. Evan joined the Fight for the Future after spending years working and traveling as a social justice musician and workshop organizer, which kind of sounds like what I used to do a number of years ago, but my music days are on hold, have been for a while. Hers or not. Evan Greer, thanks so much for being with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me on the show.
So listen, I got very interested in what you guys were doing with Reset the Net, and but I'm not going to talk about it because I think you'd be better suited to tell us just briefly what Fight for the Future does and what the Reset the Net. You had a day of action this week, and maybe you could first tell us just in a sentence or two about Fight for the Future, and Reset the Net.
Sure thing. So Fight for the Future is a digital rights organization. And in layman's terms, basically what that means is we try to keep governments and corporations from screwing up the internet that we all love. And so we're best known for organizing some of the first protests against SOPA, the Stop Online Piracy Act, which many of your listeners would remember from a few years ago. And we organized and helped build a bunch of the tools for the SOPA blackout when Wikipedia, Google, and so many of the other largest sites on the web blacked out to help destroy that bill that would have led to massive censorship online. And so what's been going on recently is yesterday was June 5th, the anniversary of the first story based on Edward Snowden's whistleblowing in The Guardian and Washington Post. And so to mark that anniversary, we organized a massive campaign called Reset the Net, which brought together, once again, the largest websites on the internet to actually directly block mass surveillance through spreading the use of encryption technology and through creating an environment where tech companies needed to start upgrading their security to respond to users' demands. And so what happened yesterday was just simply incredible. We saw, again, the largest sites on the web, Mozilla, Google, Imgur, Reddit, Wikipedia, TechDirt, all of these sites coming out with major announcements about what they were doing, coming out with support for the campaign, and helping drive traffic to a privacy pack, which is full of free open source software that's easy for any average internet user to use to actually protect their communications from mass government surveillance.
And I thought that idea was awesome. Fight for the Future's idea, Reset the Net idea, where among other things, not only are the big sites objecting, but people could go and download software to encrypt their messaging and communications and protect themselves. Now, I got to ask you, Evan, though, part of me, I read stories that said, for example, when people downloaded the Tor browser, which was supposed to help with that immediately put them on the radar of the NSA if they weren't already, and maximized their scrutiny. And other stories have said that, well, they found backdoors in a lot of this software. Can people be reasonably sure if they provide if they access these tools, which I want to do and plan to do myself, can people be reasonably sure that they'll work and that it won't backfire on them?
This is a great question. And the first thing I'd say is that everyone can be more than reasonably sure, in fact, absolutely sure, that if you're not using any type of privacy software to protect yourself, your communications absolutely are easily accessible and very likely being scooped up and monitored and recorded for the long haul by intelligence agencies. And so while you're absolutely correct, there's been a huge flurry of stories recently about all kinds of vulnerabilities in the internet. Heartbleed, of course, was the big one that everyone talked about. Many privacy tools that people have been using to protect themselves, the government, of course, has been working to undermine. In many ways, this is an arms race. But the reality is, it's very difficult to stop targeted surveillance. If the government is looking at you personally, and you have a very good reason to protect your communications from them, I would basically, my recommendation would be to not talk about anything on the internet if you can possibly avoid it, because it is always a risk. There's always some trust involved. That said, for most of us, what's detrimental is the dragnet surveillance, where they're just scooping up massive amounts of unencrypted plain text data that's just floating around online. That's what we can easily prevent by everyone taking some very easy steps that will protect their communications from that. And so while, again, it's difficult to stop those targeted attacks if the NSA or another agency is looking directly at you, but it is actually very easy for the average internet user to protect themselves from getting sucked up into that dragnet, which means if the NSA wants to look at you 5 years from now, they can't just go back in time and find and look through their database of everything they've collected on everyone and have everything you've ever done online.
Well, I
benefit.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great answer, Evan. And I think that the other piece of it is it sends a message. It sends a political message. First of all, it sends a message to the NSA even if they have a way around it, hey, you know what, you're not welcome in this household. And number two, it sends a message politically. If we can say that X 100,000 people that went to the trouble to download the software, that's yet another, it's like a human petition to the government saying, we don't like what you're doing and we don't want you to do it to us. So for both of those reasons, as well as for the intrinsic value of it, I think the Reset the Net campaign was a terrific idea. And so my question for you now is, first of all, one, where can I go to do this and reset the net, even though the day itself has passed? Two, what's next for Fight for the Future and this initiative?
Great questions. So first, everyone should, if you're not driving, if you're at a computer or you're on your phone, head to resetthenet.org and click on that big link that says the Privacy Pack is now available. That's going to take you to our Privacy Pack page, which has a bunch of recommendations for different applications you can use to protect yourself. And it's broken down to make it really easy by what platform you're using or what device you're on. So you can say, okay, I want to secure my phone. And we've got some options for if you got an iPhone, you got an Android phone, get these apps. You can secure your text messages. You can chat on your phone.
Okay. We only got about 20 seconds, Evan, just to warn you.
Great. I'll wrap it up. Thanks so much. And so that's where you got to be. Resetthenet.org. You can get all kinds of applications there, tons of recommendations for other stuff. But again, the most important thing here is this is a culture change. Everyone needs to start thinking about privacy. This isn't about whether we have something to hide. It's about whether or not we want to live in a democracy. And if we do, we need to shut mass surveillance off the web, and we can only do it ourselves. No one's going to do it for us, especially not Congress.
Well, great points. Privacy was a good idea when they wrote the Magna Carta, and it's still a good idea today. Evan Greer, campaign manager for Fight for the Future, talking about Reset the Net, and also Evan's music is available at www.evangreer.org. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Richard R.J. Eskow, and this has been another edition of The Zero Hour.